each other. Part 1, which is where we'll spend most of our time, is on de-escalation fundamentals. Because like most things in life, it's all the work in preparing for the moment that takes the most effort, not just the moment itself. Then in part 2, we will talk about the moment of civil discourse, and that will go by rather quickly. What this workshop is not, is it's not crisis management. I am not qualified to teach you all in crisis management. The only advice I can give is that you should not compromise your physical or emotional safety. And it's worth defining here emotional safety. We're all very familiar with physical safety, but emotional safety is disengaging with people who dehumanize you. When they start comparing you to non-human things like vermin and scum and whatnot, and they're starting to dehumanize you in their mind and start stripping you of your human rights. That is a slippery slope to having your physical safety threatened. Now, with that said, I will say some things that we discussed tonight will be difficult, like hot takes 3 and 4 that we saw. And I ask you to separate that feeling of emotional safety and make a distinguishment between that and when your worldview and beliefs are challenged. Those are 2 different things. And the latter is typically a sign that you should lean in because you might have something to learn about yourself, other people, and the world at large. So digging a little bit deeper, part 1 is going to be why these topics become escalated in the first place, then why we typically approach these topics so poorly, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how to de-escalate. Part 2 is how to have civil discourse, and then how to truly connect while having that. So I do have a few rules of engagement. I ask that you be present. You all physically made it here, despite how confusing it is to find this place. So congratulations, and thank you. So please be fully with us tonight. Also engage respectfully and compassionately. Like we saw, we're going to be discussing some difficult topics, some difficult statements are going to be coming up, and so it rests on creating a psychologically safe space together tonight. To help with that, choose curiosity over judgment. Allow yourself to explore new mindsets that perhaps you don't personally identify with, and be patient with your discomfort. It's possible to take hold of a belief that is not your own, long enough to grapple with it, understand it a little bit better, and then you can set it aside and go on your way. But it's that grappling that we're going to try to work through tonight. And please ask questions at any time. You don't have to wait for me to prompt, just raise your hand, shout it out, make this time your own. So the first test, do you have any questions? Yes. I have given this once before. You guys are session number 2. All right. Thank you. All right. So we're going to talk about first why these topics become escalated. So we're going to talk about what gets in the way of civil discourse. And we'll start off this section with a quote that I love so much from Brene Brown. As much time as I spend researching the way, I spend 10 times the time researching what gets in the way. So it's not enough for us to look over the barriers at the civil discourse that we so badly want and become frustrated when we're not getting there because our eyes are on the prize, if you will. Instead, we need to turn our vision closer to look at the barriers that we are coming up against and take the time to understand them. Because by understanding those barriers, we'll have the patience to overcome them. And that patience is going to be so key because it is very easy to judge or dismiss people who have a differing belief than you when things get escalated. You might have thought to yourself at one time or another, they are such an idiot. They're not worth my time. Or they don't know what they're talking about. Or they've been fed misinformation. What a brainwashed lunatic. I think we're probably all guilty of those thoughts to some degree. Maybe even some more colorful ones. But it's important that we must resist the reflex to judge and dismiss and instead have patience. So let's cover a couple perspectives that will help us build that patience. The first is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a concept from psychology. So back in the day, Abraham Maslow created a basic theory of human needs and how it impacts our behavior as people. And so it starts off from our most basic needs to our most advanced. So we start with physiological needs, air, water, etc., things that keep us alive as human beings. And then we get into our safety, kind of that next level of survival, if you will, such as security, employment, resources, our health, etc. Then we get into the social aspect, where we have friendship and intimacy. We get that love and belonging from the people around us. And then when we start going into the esteem section, we now are concerned with our own recognition within that group of people. And we start becoming both an individual and part of the group. And lastly, it's that desire to self-actualize, to become the most that one can be, which is typically a lifelong pursuit for all of us. Now, an important concept for us to understand from Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that lower level needs must be met before higher level needs can be pursued. So for example, if you're operating at the esteem level, you're trying to build up your career, you're trying to build a name for yourself, and then all of a sudden Hurricane Milton comes through and destroys your home. That's going to bring you to your knees and drop you to that physiological needs level. You're going to set your career aside so that you can focus on meeting your basic need of shelter. Now, with that in mind, now we can start drawing some connections between political topics and Maslow's hierarchy. Political topics have this knack for really hitting hard on our lower level fundamental needs. And when people feel these needs are threatened, they will go to that level to defend them, whether productively or unproductively, but they will feel that urge to go into defense mode. So just drawing those connections a little bit more clearly, we can look at the first level, our physiological needs. Political topics that connect to that level: abortion, sexual offenses, what happens to sexual offenders, housing, pollution, climate change. All of these can escalate so quickly because they drop us to that physiological needs level that we feel we need to defend. And if we feel something's being threatened, even if it's not, that's how we will react, as if it is being threatened. Going into safety needs, think about gun control, violent crime, healthcare, the economy, taxes, foreign policy, wars, etc. They all hit on that fundamental need for safety. Lastly, we'll cover love and belonging, LGBTQ plus movement, racial equity, gender equity, immigration, isolation such as that caused by the COVID-19 lockdown procedures. All of that impacted our need to have love, to give love, and to belong with a group of people. And so have some grace with people when these topics come up, because just the mention of the topic name is enough to bring someone down to that level and perhaps feel the need to defend it. Any questions on that topic before we switch into the second portion of building this perspective? Yes. Interesting. And so definitely, depending on which aspect of the topic and how the topic is being presented, maybe which way it's being spun, it could definitely hit on different needs. So you could imagine how quickly it would become escalated if someone feels it impacts their love and belonging, their safety, and their physiological needs all at once. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts anyone would like to share? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. I would agree with you. Yes, they can definitely move. It could even be in, the esteem bucket up here, say that you are the first generation American of your family. And then you feel that because you have immigration as part of your history, that it impacts your status and your recognition even. So yes, fully agree. There are boxes and lines, but it is not that clear cut. All right. So moving into the second thing to help us build this patience. The, Thank you. I got a good chuckle too when I found this. So, our perception is our reality. How we see the world is the world to us. And so when someone asks you to change your mind, they're actually asking you to change your world. And with that change, like any change, you will inevitably suffer a loss of some form. Maybe that's respect for somebody that you cared for. Maybe you grew up and your father taught you that all women are sexual objects. And you go out and experience life and you realize that that's not the case. And by gaining respect for women, you lose the respect for the man who taught you otherwise. Maybe it's camaraderie with your friends. Maybe your friends taught you that drugs were super cool and they're totally safe and it's just a good way to hang out. And then you start reading about fentanyl overdoses and the deaths from those. And by gaining a greater sense for self preservation, you lose the camaraderie with your friends. Maybe it's trust in your upbringing. Maybe you were raised in a home where your parents taught you everything outside of your hometown, the entire world out there is dangerous and people are out to get you, and you should just stay home. And then you go out and you explore and you realize that there are good people everywhere. And there is this amazing sense of common humanity that unites all of us. And by gaining that perspective and that joy, you lose trust in your upbringing. What else were you raised in that wasn't true? Or maybe it's a very part of your identity. Maybe you were raised in a religion where there are only two genders and you go about your life and you realize that that doesn't fit you. And so by changing that part of your identity, you lose the original part of your identity. And so the next time that you come across someone who is being stubborn in their way of thought, who maybe has escalated the dialogue, and you're just thinking to yourself, why won't they just change their mind? Why won't they just put some common sense in their head, get rational about this, listen to the evidence, listen to the argument that I'm making, which is very beautifully constructed, and just change their mind? Remember to ask yourself, what loss may they suffer by changing their mind? What fear may be keeping them from that, whether consciously or unconsciously? It's a scary prospect to change your mind, and it doesn't even end here. Changing one's mind is saying, okay, we're suffering a loss, and now with that feeling of loss, go humbly enter a less familiar place where maybe your family isn't with you, maybe your friends aren't with you, maybe people question you because you weren't always of this line of thought, you came from somewhere else, and maybe you have a lot to learn. So imagine you're on this mountaintop here and you're living in your world. Maybe it's a world of false dichotomies, maybe there's some grays in there. But you see the world clearly around you. You see it for what it is, and you're going on your merry way. And someone comes across to you and they try to push you into this fog and they say, everything you believe and how you view the world isn't right, but you have to go through this fog to see the world as it is. You're going to resist that. That is a scary prospect to leave what you know and enter into the unknown. And so, in summary, these topics become escalated because they hit on our foundational needs as people. They threaten our view of the world and of ourselves. They threaten us with a loss, which is typically something very personal and very significant. And they ask us to enter the unfamiliar with humility. These are barriers. to civil discourse. This is why it's so hard. And so with that, we've learned that these are very sensitive topics. They need to be treated with care. So why are we so bad at this? Why do we typically do this so poorly? Before we launch into that, any questions? Yes. Interesting. So when you're in your world of potentially false dichotomies and people are saying, that's right, you drew the boxes correct. What you believe is how the world is. And so it takes patience to overcome that. And that is what we're going to get into in this workshop. So please hold. That's okay. Mike jumped the gun in the last one, so that's okay. All right. So we're going to start off this section with a quote from William Jones, and it is, whenever you're in conflict with someone, there is one factor that can make the difference between damaging and deepening your relationship. That factor is attitude. Now, I came across this quote a couple months ago, and I had been on this long journey already to change my attitude towards conflict. And this was a catalyst moment for me. Now, when someone personally approaches me with a conflict, instead of thinking, oh shit, I think, okay, this is an opportunity to damage or deepen this relationship. So act accordingly, Kate. And I hope that this is as meaningful and impactful to you. But like I said, it was at a critical point on what was already a long journey to change my attitude towards conflict. So let's see where you might be on that journey. So we've got a little bit of a continuum here. There are probably more boxes in between than the 6 I'll show you, but we'll cover those tonight. So first, perhaps you feel physically ill around conflict, and it is an extremely bad thing to you. We had a volunteer mediator who was the sweetest woman, and she took our mediation training because she said, I just don't want to feel sick to my stomach anymore when people disagree around me. And so she accomplished that and much more, but that's where she started. It was a physical response. Perhaps you just feel discomfort. Conflict is unpleasant, but you'll show up and tough it out. Perhaps there's dislike and conflict is necessary to deal with, and you just say, okay, let's get this over with and move on. Perhaps you feel neutral. Conflict is a part of life, an opportunity. It's a very difficult place to be, but perhaps you are there already. Maybe you feel some positive adrenaline towards conflict and you like it when it comes around. Or maybe you like it so much that when it's not around, you create it. I think we all know some names that are coming to mind. So odds are you don't fit in any single one of those boxes because our attitudes towards conflict change with our context. Maybe you feel sick to your stomach when your spouse brings up a concern about your marriage. But then maybe you're okay with it and you'll deal with it when it's a coworker dispute. And perhaps when you are in a very heated dialogue with your political component, you're finding a thrill in that and you toss fuel on the fire. And so no matter where you are on that spectrum in any given context, it's important to recognize that very often the attitude we carry in to a conflict often negatively impacts our situation. As we saw here, neutral is really the place to be, and it's the hardest place to be. It lends you the calm to enter into conflict with a clear head, and it lends you the grit to see it through. But very few of us, when we turn 18 and go out into the world, have been taught to have just a plain neutral attitude towards conflict. Very likely, we are in one of the other 5 boxes. And so our default attitude that we carry in with us can be unproductive or even destructive. And so that is one aspect of it. That's what we're walking into it with. But then there's also our default reaction to conflict. So I have a second continuum here for you. Maybe you avoid conflict and you just disengage and you get out of there. Maybe you accommodate and you just give the person causing the conflict whatever they want so that they make it stop. Perhaps you advocate, and this can kind of be done in 2 ways. One is a positive form where you advocate for your own needs and respect that the other person will advocate for theirs, or in a negative sense where you advocate for your own needs at the expense of them being able to advocate for theirs. Or perhaps you appeal, at which point you relinquish your authority in the situation and you say, I cannot control this. And so I'm going to give it to a higher power that I think will be able to and have somebody else intervene. Or maybe you attack and you meet violence with violence. Now, the important thing to recognize is that our defaults and where we wind up on this continuum, it's a learned placement based on our experiences. So perhaps you grew up with a verbally and physically abusive parent. Where you fall on this continuum as an adult will depend on what your experience was like, your unique experience, what you tried, what you saw others tried, what worked and what didn't work. So maybe you learned just to avoid that parent. Just completely disengage, hole up in your room, don't go home, whatever that looks like. And you thought that that was the safe way to go. Maybe you accommodated and you became a bit of a people pleaser then as an adult. Maybe you advocated, which typically doesn't work very well in a situation of abuse. Or perhaps you appealed, whether it was to a figure of authority within the family or outside of the family. And you said, I can't do anything about this, but I'm going to try to bring somebody else to intervene. Or maybe you attacked and you met hit for hit. So once again, we can see that often our defaults are unproductive or destructive. What we walk into it with our attitude and how we default react, our gut reaction to it. As we said, the positive form of advocacy is really the most productive place to be. But once again, a lot of us, when we enter into the world as adults, that's not where we are. It's a journey to get there. And so we need to be patient with people as they're either struggling on the journey to change their attitude and default reaction to conflict, or recognize that some people haven't embarked on that journey yet. And they don't even know where they are on this continuum. And so we've talked a lot about how our attitudes and our default reactions, that is where we are right now. And often it's not very helpful to the situation. So why did they come to be in the first place? How do we overcome them? And to overcome them and move on, it's very helpful to understand their origins, because every attitude and default reaction to conflict has an origin story. So to help us understand origins, there's a tool of the ladder of inference. And so this is another concept from psychology, and it helps us to slow down and analyze why we act the way we act and why we think the way we think. And so we form our beliefs and take action subsequent to them based on coming up the ladder. Yeah, John. Yeah. So, what I have found is the strategy we will cover and how to actually de escalate works with all of those. These you have to get to the table first, and that can be a little tricky. And these you just have to make sure that there's not a physical or emotional safety risk, but otherwise it is applicable to them. If you disagree with me, let me know. We can talk about it on Thursday. So, all right. So, jumping back to the ladder of inference then. So, we form our beliefs by climbing up this ladder, and we're typically not conscious of this when it's happening. And so, real quick, we've got the whole world of observable information around us. Then there's what we directly interact with, those observations. There's the selected data, whether we select it consciously or unconsciously. It's what we pay attention to that actually sits with us. And then we escalate in terms of the meanings we attach to them. They start as simple meanings, then they go into broader assumptions, broader conclusions, and broader beliefs. And so we travel up this ladder again and again as we form or reinforce our beliefs and take those actions. And that's helpful to know. But typically, what we're left with consciously is seeing our own actions and those of others and hearing their expressed beliefs or expressing our own. So it's helpful to work our way down the ladder to either creatively analyze ourselves and why we act and think the way we do, or to creatively think about why other people act and think the way they do. So that was a lot of theory. So let's go through an example to help that really set in. So say you and I are political opponents, and I disengage with your political hot take because I believe this is going nowhere. Because I've concluded you are entrenched in your position. Because I've assumed you've intentionally made your language inflammatory. And I know that inflammatory language means you don't want to listen or learn. And I know this because such language was used by my abusive father when he yelled at me for things I had no control over. And he used such language at other times, but my gut tells me this isn't worth it and that I should disengage before investing too much of myself in this. And so notice how at no point was the reason that I don't care about our country, that I don't value democracy, that I don't think this topic is important, or I think you're an idiot. That was never the reason. It was something deeply personal and nuanced. And so using the ladder of inference helps us respect that people have many potential reasons for their actions and belief. It reminds us to not assume that we know why they're acting a certain way or why they hold a certain belief so dear, or to attribute. And we'll pause on the word attribute here. And so a concept of psychology is the fundamental attribution error. It's a bit of a mouthful. Essentially, what it says is we tend to very quickly draw conclusions on people's character based on their behavior. So, who of you have seen someone behaving like a jerk? Okay. Bill, you've never had some? Wow. Okay. And you might have thought to yourself, wow, they are a jerk. Congratulations, you just committed the fundamental attribution error. You drew a conclusion based on their behavior about their character. And this reminds us not to do that, that there is a separation between how people behave and who they are as a person. And so then let's go deeper in the ladder of inference to figure out that origin story. So, yes. And so it helps us to consider why might someone do or think that, and what could have happened in their life. And so there's a great book called What Happened to You by Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry that I would highly recommend. And it helps you change the script so that when you see someone acting or expressing a belief that you don't agree with and you think to yourself, what is wrong with you? Instead, you ask yourself, what happened to you? And it gets you into that more compassionate mindset to think about why might they be that way? So maybe you're thinking to yourself, geez, Kate, that's an interesting framework, but I'll never remember that. There are 8 rungs to that ladder, and I can hardly remember them now, and much less in the heat of a moment in a heated dialogue. And so let's talk about the simpler rule of 6 with the concept of the ladder of inference in the back of our minds. And so this is where you can think of 6 reasons why someone acts or thinks the way they do. So we're all very good at coming up with the first reason, but the rule of 6 then asks us to go deeper and think of 5 more. So we'll cover an example. This is a real example from a family member of mine when they were working down south. And one of their coworkers said to them, "It's not long until that black woman is fired." All right. So the first reason we all had for them saying this was they are an insensitive racist. And then if we didn't practice the rule of 6, we would have went about our lives thinking that they are that. Practicing the rule of 6, let's come up with 5 more. Maybe they feel they are preparing you by sharing a fact. Maybe they know the culture of the organization a little bit better, and they're just trying to do you a favor. It's not perhaps a good workplace culture, but perhaps they're trying to look out for you. Maybe they just like the thrill of gossip. Maybe Black had nothing to do with being a racist. It was just a way to identify a person in a group of people. And they just really like to talk about who comes and goes from the company. We're probably not going to think any more highly of them as a person, but this could be the reason. Maybe they feel intimidated by her skill. Maybe this is their way of expressing a fear and that they're hoping will go away. Maybe they're tired and didn't filter their thoughts well. Maybe under normal circumstances, they wouldn't have said this, but maybe the baby didn't sleep well last night and they are just exhausted and their filter let it slip through. Or maybe it has nothing to do with them, and maybe you misunderstood them. Maybe they said it's not long until that black woman is hired. Maybe she's working on contract and they're thinking she's going to get offered a full-time position. And so the rule of 6 helps us to slow down and to think past that first reason that we attribute to people. So let's go ahead and practice this. So in your groups, feel free to combine tables if you would like. Go ahead and choose any of these sentiments that particularly speaks to you and come up with 6 experiences that may have led a person to hold that belief. Go at it. So let's go ahead and be ready to share in about a minute here. All right, it sounds like we're about ready. So let's go ahead and debrief together. Who would like to start off by sharing which statement they chose and some of the reasons that they came up with as a group? Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Any other reasons anyone else from the table would like to share? Seems good. And I mean, going off of what you said, if you had one bad experience with a vaccine or knew somebody who did, that one can be enough to form this opinion. I mean, I know when I get a vaccine, I feel wiped out the next day. And I have thought to myself, if I wasn't raised to think this was normal, I'd probably question it too. So, thank you for sharing. You, yes. Sure. Who wants to use the mic first? All right, I think there's, yeah, I think you volunteered. Would you like to be the spokesperson? No. Would you like to?
Bonjour. Okay. Wonderful. So we picked illegals are dangerous. And the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 reasons, or the why, basically, this also reminds me of Kaizen. Is anyone familiar with Kaizen? Yeah. Yeah. It's like the why, and why, right? It just reminded me of that. One, education. That's how they've been taught, and they didn't think critically about it. The other one is exposure. They haven't been exposed to perhaps, immigrants. A third could be media, influence of media. I think these are all things somebody mentioned. They're also social media or any other media. Then we thought about the personal lived experience with one person, and then generalization, which you just addressed. And lastly, it's the term illegal means you're not legal, right? You're not abiding by the law. And in fact, if you're undocumented, that is illegal. So it's that interpretation of literal interpretation of the law. That's it.
That was excellent. Thank you for thinking so deeply on that. And I'm really glad that you brought up the subject of media and how influential that can be. Because even seeing one very compelling piece of media can be enough to have people just climb up that ladder and stay there. Yeah. Yeah. Or the constant commercials. Yeah. Yes. Kind of have that reinforcing aspect very much. All right. Which of the last two tables would like to go next? You like to?
Well, we started with the same subject, but we had better answers, I think. No, actually, I wanted to copy some of yours down. Illegals are dangerous. Obviously, your experience of life. Maybe you had a bad experience with an illegal that moved next door and played loud music all night. Maybe that formed your opinion. Reinforced by outside forces like the media or social media and culture. What is your family background? Maybe your family background is you were told from an early stage in your life that immigrants are evil or don't trust blacks or don't trust Asians. Maybe that's part of the attitude of your community. Look at what we went through before the Civil War in the South. I mean, that's a good example of the culture making you have attitudes that are negative towards others.
Thank you so much for sharing. I love the applause. That's so encouraging. And very much so about the upbringing aspect. I mean, when we think about it, our family is our world. It's our first world. And it forms a lot of those fundamental beliefs that can be very sticky throughout your life and take a lot of work to overcome. All right, last but not least, this table, who would like to speak?
About maybe you misunderstood on your previous slide. So like all of these, like what if they really said doing drugs isn't a crime? Maybe they were just questioning it and really weren't stating it. Or the definition of what they thought a crime is, is we all have a different definition of crime. And so we really need to understand, what did you say?
And not only that, but even once you get the words down, what does that word mean to you exactly? Digging deeper into that. Well, thank you all for participating in that exercise. And so, debriefing together here, as we saw, there are many different reasons and more that we can't imagine for why people act the way they do and why they think the way they do. And so remember this and be humble in your ignorance of other people's lives. Remember, I agree. It's something I remind myself all the time. And, it was brought up in the first session about how it's coming more into the modern realm that the phrase of walk a mile in someone else's shoes, take a moment to stand in their shoes, that really isn't enough. It gives you this false perception that you can fully understand where they came from by putting yourself with all of your experiences and all your beliefs and all of your privilege in their shoes. It's still you in their shoes. Yes. What classes are those? Social work. Thank you for sharing. Yes. And so, in order to be humble in your ignorance of other people's lives, it's important to keep the concept of the ladder of inference in your mind and to practice the rule of 6, and to do so with the intention to understand, not to undermine. You're not trying to dig through their past to find a fallacy that you can attack. You're trying to figure out the origin story so that you can reserve judgment and approach with patience and curiosity. And so, in summary of this section, we typically approach these topics so poorly as people because our default attitudes and reactions toward conflict are often unproductive and destructive. And we typically form those very early in life, and it's a journey to rewrite those. And understanding the origins of our learned defaults helps us to reserve judgment and approach with humble curiosity. So now the moment you've all been waiting for. We've talked about why they become escalated. We've talked about why we typically handle them so poorly. So now what do we do in the moment to de-escalate? I'm sorry to tell you this, but it starts with you. So just like how the previous section began with our default attitudes towards conflict, this section begins with your mindset that you bring into conflict. And so this was not my brainchild here. Instead, it was Claire Canfield. There was a wonderful TED Talk he did called The Beauty of Conflict that I would highly recommend. And in it, he summarizes very nicely as the word vocab for the mindset that we can bring with us into conflict. And so we start with vulnerability. And that is the willingness to be seen by another person. It's taking off your armor, it's laying down your weapons so that you can openly connect with somebody else. And this can be very scary to do, especially when you're facing someone who you see as an adversary. It will literally feel disarming. But it is so important that you take that first step to show vulnerability, to try to connect, because very rarely will the other person take it first. But very often, they'll take it after you have and demonstrated that it's safe to do so. And so that brings us into the second part, ownership. So it's taking ownership for how perhaps you contributed to the escalated situation. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. And to take ownership for rewriting script and changing the directory down a more productive path. And that is what we'll be talking about today, especially in how to communicate. So how to ask, listen, and express our beliefs in a way that can truly be heard by the other person. The A in vocab is for acceptance, and that comes to play that it's accepting that conflict is inevitable, it is a part of life, and it can be a good part of life if we manage it well. So it's not wishing for it to go away, it's not disengaging with it or trying to snuff it out. It's just accepting that this is part of it so that we can approach it with that calm and grit neutral attitude. And there's also those boundaries, setting what is okay and not okay in the dialogue. Again, making sure that you're not compromising your physical or emotional safety. So this is one concept on how to de-escalate. It's how you show up. That is a very critical piece. A second critical piece is the concept of storm versus calm. So perhaps you're familiar with phrases such as, they turned on a dime. There was just a switch that flipped in them. All of a sudden, they're not acting like themselves, or there's a stranger in front of me now. Those are all cliches to describe the concept of somebody being in storm. Very simply put, you are in storm when things are not going okay for you, whatever that means for you. And when we are in storm, our style changes. How we behave, how we speak, how we make decisions. And it can be rather unflattering how we act in storm. And so the first step is recognizing that storm exists and when it's occurring. And then the next step is not doing a few things. So when someone is in storm, do not inflame, blame, or shame them. This came from another TED Talk, which I could not re-find, unfortunately, but they beautifully put that when somebody is escalated and things are getting heated, don't toss fuel on the fire, even though it can be very, very tempting to do so. Don't blame them for their immediate initial reactions and attitudes. As we saw, there's usually complex and nuanced reasons for why they're behaving the way they are. And don't shame them for who they are as an individual and what they believe. All of those would only serve to intensify the storm and further stifle civil discourse. Don't try to control them. This one can be hard. It means you can't use phrases like, don't say that. Don't you dare go there. Just calm down. All of those are you trying to control them. The best thing you can do is work on controlling yourself, the environment, the scope of the conversation, the trajectory of the conversation, everything that we'll focus on more in this workshop. And last but not least, don't judge them for being in storm. Remember that politics very easily pushes people into storm, as we saw with Maslow's hierarchy of needs earlier. Or maybe people are just in storm for any given reason. Maybe it's not even the topic you're talking about that they walked into the conversation in storm already. Maybe they're going through marital issues. Maybe they're worried about a test result that's going to come back from the doctor soon. Maybe they're exhausted as they try to move their parent who is aged into assisted living. Maybe they spilled their coffee that morning. You don't know. And so don't judge them for being in storm. And the easiest way to remember that is to remember that we've all done and said things that we aren't proud of. So be generous. Give them grace in those moments to hopefully open the door to a meaningful dialogue with them. And so once we recognize storm, how do we shift the situation from storm to calm to actually make space for that meaningful dialogue? And it all begins with the power of pause. There's a lot that you can do in a very simple pause. It starts with recognizing, but not hearing, not internalizing the attack that they may have shared, and recognizing and controlling any emotional hijacking. So perhaps English is your second language, and somebody tells you, if you don't speak English, you don't belong in America. You're probably going to feel that attack on yourself and your family, that love and belonging, maybe even the physiological needs may feel threatened depending on the situation. So it's important to recognize that they used language in which there was an attack, and that attack is probably hijacking you. It's probably making you want to attack back. And so it's very important to use that pause to stop before you weaponize your own words. Think to yourself, all right, this is my first thought. I really want to say it. But ask yourself why you want to say it. Is it going to harm or hurt them, or is it going to help the situation? And so typically we have to swallow our first words that we think of to avoid getting into that attack, counterattack mode. And taking that chance to self-regulate. Maybe it's some deep breaths. Maybe it's picturing your happy place, whatever self-regulation means to you so that you can physically calm down. And that's an important step so that you have the mental wherewithal to take responsibility for building that psychologically safe environment. Because I'm sorry to say, but when you walk out of this room tonight, odds are you're going to have to take that first step. Odds are very good that somebody else won't, and you'll have to step up and take that ownership to build that and to approach it with curiosity while you do so. So we're going to go deeper into what taking this responsibility and what you can actually do looks like. But first, I'm going to lead you through 2 exercises so that you have a bit of a metaphor, a bit of a visualization to go along with this approach that we'll cover. It'll help you remember it a lot better. So the first is hand to hand. So go ahead and find a partner, somebody that you have not met yet, and stand face to face with them. Oh, that's good. Do you want to push or you push?
Hi, thank you. I have to leave early because we travel early tomorrow, but
Oh,
this was
okay.
great, like at least for the beginning of it.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
And it's recorded too if you want.
Awesome. Okay, so I can watch the rest of it. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Have a great
Thank you
night.
so much for coming. All right. Looks like you're ready for further instructions. So everybody stand as my lovely husband and I are standing. He is part of the demonstration. And so have one person face their back towards the food table. Orientate yourselves, and the other one face their back towards that wall like I am. All right. Looks like we're pretty good. All right, so now what you're going to do is you're going to get a little stance where you have 1 foot forward and 1 foot back. And then you're going to put your hand like this in front of yourself, kind of right in front of your belly button. All right. And then the backs of your hands are going to meet. And on the count of 3, those with their backs towards the food, nod if you know who you are. All right. Looks like we all got it. Push their hand towards their belly button on the count of, well, I'll say on go, just for clarity. Are we all ready? All right. 1, 2, 3, go. All right. Disengage. All right. So that was part 1 of the exercise. So when you were met with force, what'd you do? You pushed back. Very natural. Someone was trying to move towards your most vulnerable place, your belly. And so you pushed back so that they wouldn't go there. So, very natural response. But now, what we're going to do is try to rewrite that default in ourselves. And so, we're going to do an exercise called yield and redirect. So this is from Tai Chi, for any of those Tai Chi masters out there. I am not a Tai Chi master myself, but I can lead you through this exercise. So what you'll do is with your partner, go ahead and have that same stance, and you still have your hands back to back. And then as the person pushes towards you, try to anticipate and react with an equal amount of pullback. So move with them, let them move you. And then inevitably, so that they don't go off balance, they're going to stop. And then you redirect and you move them. And at each pause, then the other person picks it up. All right, I'm seeing some looks of understanding. So go ahead and give it a try. That one looks like dancing. Yeah. Very cute. All right. Thank you. And thank you, Jaden. All right. So go ahead and find your way back to your seat. So thank you for potentially going out of your comfort zone and practicing some Tai Chi with us tonight. So how did it feel? How did it feel to meet force with yielding and redirecting? Mm-hmm. 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 It is hard. And it takes getting over some discomfort to get to the point where it feels good and you're really making movement together. Any other thoughts? Non-confrontational. Exactly. Like a dance. I love it. That came up in our first session too. I was hoping someone would draw that. Especially you, John and Lisa. I felt like you were kind of going like on swoops and everything. Wonderful. So we can see that by yielding and redirecting, we made more progress together. It was a nicer experience together. And the issue with the phrase yield and redirect is it starts with yield. And most people kind of bristle at that. And they say, what do you mean I need to yield to my adversary here, the person that I'm in a disagreement with? Doesn't that mean I'm agreeing with them or I'm showing weakness or etc.? But you just saw it opens the door to an opportunity to actually have influence where otherwise you wouldn't have had any ground to give. And so you might be thinking, Well, that was a little fun. Maybe I'll take up a Tai Chi class. But how do we do this in a conversation? And so that's what we're going to talk about. So the approach is to first show curiosity. It's letting the other person move you. It's that decision to not meet force with force. Then it's listening for interest. It's becoming in tune with each other as you move. Then prove you listened by consciously addressing that turning point where they've exhausted the direction that they're moving in, and now there's a little bit of a pause before you redirect. And when you redirect, look to the future and be gentle with the redirection. So I'll give you a personal example, a story to help you visualize this before we dive into each of these steps individually. So my grandparents are at a point in their life where my grandpa is in respite care while my grandma was recovering from an injury at home. And so I call up my grandma a couple months ago and I say, "Hey, how's it going?" And she says, "Kate, I am so glad you called. I have a plan and I want to get your thoughts on it." I said, "Okay." So I took a breath, took a pause, and I said, "Tell me more." And so she said that she was going to go to bed early that night so she could wake up early. So she could go by my grandpa in respite care, put him in his wheelchair, just say they're going on a walk. They'll be back soon. Take him to the car, put him in the car, and drive him home. And that's it. Then he'd be home with her, and he'd never be checked out, but it's fine. At least he'd be home. And so I paused, and I swallowed some of the thoughts that maybe other granddaughters would have said. Maybe it was, "Gran, you're crazy. That'll never work. Don't do that." Judgment, judgment, trying to control her. That wouldn't work. That would damage the relationship. And it's unfair and untrue. She's not crazy. As I learned, when I showed curiosity, because I asked her, I was like, "I'm not very familiar with your situation. Can you please tell me more about what's been going on with you two lately?" And then I listened for the ultimate interests as she told her story. And then I proved I listened by explaining what those interests were. And I said, "Gran, I get it. There was a recent COVID outbreak at the facility that he's staying at. You're worried about his physical well-being and you're worried about his mental well-being from the isolation of the lockdown on his floor. If my husband were in that situation, I'd sure as heck be tempted to break him out of respite care and bring him home too." And then I looked to the future. I said, "So let's walk through this step by step together on what this would look like. You get him in the wheelchair and you get him to the car. Can you get him in the car?" "No." "Okay, well, let's benefit of the doubt. Say you get him in the car. You're home. Can you get him in the house?" "No." "Well, let's say you call up your son and you get him in the house. So now he's in bed. What does your life look like now?" And she said, "Well, I'd tell him to never leave bed and I'd take care of him." And I said, "Do you think that would work? He's got a mind of his own. He likes to wander." She said no. Eventually he would get up and he'd fall again, and then he'd probably be in the hospital and we'd be in a worse off place. But she came to that conclusion. And we got there by walking through it together. And we deepened our relationship by doing so. And so that's yielding and redirecting in a personal example. So let's go into each of these steps. The first, showing curiosity, encouraging them to share more. This is asking open-ended but non-defense inspiring questions. A lot of people leave it as just open-ended, but you can get yourself in trouble with some open-ended questions and really shut down a meaningful dialogue. For example, let's return to hot take number 3. Women who get abortions are murderers. Maybe you could respond with the open-ended question of, why would you think that? Why typically puts people on the defense? Asking them to explain themselves. It's a very natural thing for us to ask, but it is defense inspiring. So let's scratch that. What evidence do you have to back that up? It's not a why question, but you're also kind of putting them on the stand, almost as if they're in court. You have to defend your position, and that can really put people's guards up too. All right, so not that. Who are you to say that? Well, now you're questioning their very beliefs as an individual and their right to those beliefs. So instead, it would sound something like, tell me more about how you feel on this topic. What helped you draw that conclusion? And this is a very carefully crafted phrase. What helped you draw that conclusion? In mediations, I used to think it was wise to say, what led you to that conclusion? And then I started asking myself, maybe people don't like the concept of being led to a conclusion. We like to feel that we draw our own conclusions and we are in control of that. And so that's how that question came to be. So showing curiosity, asking those open-ended questions that don't inspire defensiveness. The second step was listening for interests. So this is where we can define the difference between positions and interests. Positions are what we want. Interests go deeper and they answer the question of why we want it, what problem we're solving by getting what we're asking for. So let's put this in our example of hot take number 4. I want no restrictions on my gun ownership. The position is very clear, no restrictions. And that's typically where most people end, and we endlessly debate our positions. The interests that might be underlying this position, though, are personal, and they're based on that person's experience as an individual. Maybe it's around autonomy and freedom. Maybe they grew up with a lot of controls around them and they just don't want any people meddling in their lives. Maybe it's a sense of safety. Maybe they've been on a long journey where they didn't initially believe that they were worth defending, that they didn't have enough self-worth to defend themselves, but they've overcome that. And they see that gun as the path to that safety and that reinforcement that they are worth protecting. Maybe it's a personal hobby enjoyment and how they feel that they can stay sane and face the world every day. Or maybe it's a sense of nostalgia. Maybe it was built over generations and yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff in there, but it's part of the family. And so it's important that you listen for these interests, because people won't typically come up to you and say, well, my position on this matter is this, and my interest that underlies it is this. You have to dig for it, and it might be a process of discovery for both you and them. And then, step number 3, you need to prove you listened. So in order to prove you listen, you have to first actually listen. And that means exercising patience with monologues and silence. We'll dig deeper into that in some coming slides. It also means removing judgment and hard words from your mind, saying like, they're always saying that. They're never going to come around and see the light of day. Those things act as earplugs for you, and you really start shutting down your ability to genuinely listen to them. And so it's important to try to silence that internal dialogue and just truly listen. And then to prove you listen, to paraphrase. Very simply put, summarize, state the emotion, and summarize the facts. For example, you really miss your dad. The hunting trips you two took together taught you how to live a good life, and your guns are a reminder of him and those lessons. You're meeting them where they're at in their emotion, saying that they miss a loved one, something that we can all relate to. And then you're saying, I heard you. I heard what you say. You don't have to press the repeat button. I understand. Now, when we think back on the 3 steps we've had so far, showing curiosity, listening for interests, and proving that you listened, you aren't doing much talking at this point. And that can end up feeling very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And it's a lesson that we as mediators really have to learn early on. And it's a skill that we build. And so to help illustrate this, let's take an example where you are having a conversation with someone else that you've labeled as the other. So we all kind of have this mental timer or tally in our mind of how much time somebody else is talking in a conversation and how much time we're talking. And when those scales get unbalanced and they're talking a little too much, we start really wanting to talk. We get that urge to say something and be heard and be seen. And so we have this mental concept that the more airtime we have, the more we're winning a conversation in sense. And so it would look a little like this, ideally in our minds, where somebody states their opinion. We say, that's not at all how the world works. This is how it works. They say, oh, okay. And you say, good, let's move on. That would be ideal. But we all recognize that this isn't quite fair, and something more fair would look like a bit more of an equal debate between us. Equal airtime, some back and forth, etc. But what I'm here to tell you is that when you truly master yield and redirect in a conversation, it looks like this. Your airtime is pretty small. You do a lot of listening, and then you paraphrase and redirect a little, paraphrase, redirect a little, showing curiosity all throughout. And that can be really difficult to attain. And so when you're struggling with this unequal airtime, remember the power of brevity. Speak less by making more of what you say. And that means you're going to have to pause more. You're going to have to think through what you say a bit more. You're going to have to be more intentional with it. But it is utterly and completely worth the effort. And if you're questioning that, on if it's really worth it and it's really worth all the discomfort, think about a time you made a major opinion shift. Go ahead and think of one. Was it after someone long-windedly talked at you? Was it after a back and forth debate? Or was it after someone truly heard you and helped you gently explore a new way of thinking? Odds are it was the last one, and that you formed a deeper connection with that person in the process. So that is why it's worth overcoming that discomfort of equal airtime. So the last step, looking to the future. This is where we respect the past, we accept the past, but we don't get stuck there. This is something that we have to overcome a lot in mediation as well, where parties come to us in storm. They want to try to negotiate the past, which we can't. I hate to say it, even if you take our 40-hour mediation skills training, you don't gain the ability to rewrite the past. And so we take enough time to understand it, to respect it, and then we set it aside so that we can intentionally move forward together. Before we move into our exercise, are there any questions? Oh, you're all itching to try it out, aren't you? All right, so the exercise is how would you yield and redirect? And I gave you some hints up there in case you don't remember the 4 steps at the moment. This statement. Somebody comes up to you and they say, whites are all racist supremacists. You can't trust any of them. For just existing near them, they'll call the cops on you. And you know what happens when the cops come. So go ahead, rejoin your groups, and think through how you would respond to this using the yield and redirect framework. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and come back together. So who would like to start us off and share how their group chose to respond to this difficult? Oh, we've got someone volunteered.
So just starting with the prompt that was given, the how did you come to this conclusion? Tell me more about how you feel on that topic, with the assumption that they'd explain what experience or experiences led them to that conclusion. And then with that information, just validating their experience. Then moving on to redirecting, offering someone that had a similar bad experience and now had a better experience, like someone of a similar background, perhaps. Because if they're disclosing this to a white person, it may not feel the same if it's not coming from someone who has the same experiences, or strictly validate and be a positive corrective emotional experience for that person. Because if you're offering that validation, just a positive experience in itself, and not fighting back, that offers some comfort.
You want a round of applause. Fantastic. Thank you. I think that you made a really, really excellent point that even if you can't relate to them, just by being one positive experience to help try to balance the scales in their mind, try to make them see that maybe that all is a little too encompassing. Wonderful. Who would like to share next? Also volunteered.
Well, we also talked about trying to draw them out and trying to have them explain what was it that made you think that, um, and just trying to be a good listener, listening to the entire conversation and not sort of interrupting and having your own opinion. And at the end of the day, some people might not want to share everything. And so it might be that in that sort of first conversation, you don't get very far, but being willing to follow up and being patient.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that that is a point worth reiterating, that though we frame it in this workshop as if this all happens at once, it may happen over time, and you need to plant the seed and then nurture that to really get to true civil discourse with another person. How about this table? Also volunteered?
I guess we had some of the same thoughts. You have to wonder what brings a person to that conclusion to make a statement like that, and I mean, I suggested that I'd have assumption that there's some kind of racial or history of racial injustice, and you'd kind of want to draw that out, try to find out and talk about that a little bit. And as your husband mentioned, the important thing is looking to the future and what can we all do to help improve that situation.
Basically had a set of cheater notes with you too with him. But yes, I mean, typically opinions like that are rooted in pain. Yes. So if you ever want, since you volunteer in Fond du Lac with us, talk to Josh sometime. He's got a very interesting story because he was the white cop who was called in multiple Milwaukee calls around the George Floyd time. He's got a very interesting story. Josh. He's somebody that we volunteer with. So, yeah. All right. Last but not least, this table.
Well, we kind of struggled with this one because we thought, is this a white person saying this or is this a person of color saying this? Because it would be, I think, very different if it was a person of color. And we also thought there was kind of two stories here about racists and then an issue with the cops. So we kind of thought it'd be a little harder to approach this one without maybe saying something that might sort of turn them off or turn them defensive but I guess we decided the best thing to do is just try to find out what experiences they had that brought this on. And like I said, it would be, I think, two different conversations depending if it's a person of color or a white person. So this one was a little harder for us. We kind of struggled with this one. So.
Yes, in a 2-hour workshop, I did not let you start off with an easy one. We only had time for one, so you got the hard one. And so what I will share is a suggestion on how one could respond. This is how I would respond. I'm not saying it's the only way or the correct way, but it's one that I think would help lead to a meaningful conversation. I admit I don't know what it is like to be Black. You are in fear of people taking away your freedom or even your life. What experiences have you had that led to that distrust? And then later in the conversation, what do you hope for? So I'm admitting where I cannot relate. It's important to say that when you truly can't. I picked up on their interests, that there's fear. They want to protect their freedom and their very life. We dug into, as most of you did speak to, digging into what those experiences were that led to that pain and led to this sentiment. And then turning to the future. And this is a very good open-ended question to remember of just in general, what do you hope for? And then let them take it where they will. And so notice there was no defense. It wasn't, well, I'm not a racist. There was no judgment saying, oop, saying that you're paranoid or anything like that. And there was no diminishing of it, saying, well, things don't turn south very often. Instead, it was yielding and redirecting. So in summary, how we de-escalate the situation is we first and foremost focus on our own mindset. So vulnerability, ownership, communication, acceptance, and boundaries. Then we recognize storm for what it is, and we try to shift the situation to calm. And we do that by taking the power of pause and doing all of those 6 things to help us first circumvent our initial gut reactions so that we don't contribute to the problem, and then be able to move into taking ownership and creating the safe space. Then we practice yield and redirect in conversation form. So we show curiosity, we listen for interest, we prove we listened, and then we look to the future together, remembering that Tai Chi movement. So that was part 1. I said we'd spend most of the workshop there. So this next part goes very, very quickly. That was all the preparation, and now this is the moment. So how to structure the conversation, a suggestion of how this could look, especially in coming days. You start with a clear intention. You say, I'm curious to understand your perspective on the upcoming election. Open with curiosity. What are your thoughts on the candidates? Respect the past. What inspired you to think that about them? And then focus on the future. What are your hopes for the future regarding our nation? It is as simple and difficult as that. Clear intention, open with curiosity, respect the past, focus on the future. All the while keeping in mind that yield and redirect movement. And while you go through this, it's important to loop for understanding. So this concept came from the book Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg. Excellent book, would highly recommend it. And through it, he talks about looping for understanding, where you ask follow-up questions, you paraphrase what you heard, and then you seek confirmation you understood. So that part is very important. Not that you say, I hear you, you're disgruntled and you want this, and then you keep plowing right on and they say, no, 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 you misunderstood me. So slow down, make sure that you confirm that you understood them correctly. It'll help them feel heard. And to keep looping until all agree that all understand. So when we talked about how this is hard work and it takes a lot of ownership to even try it, and it takes a lot of effort to see it through, this is the moment that makes that worth it. We'll come across it in mediation where the parties come to us, everyone's in storm, the dust is flying all over the place. It's very intense. And once people feel heard and that they feel understood, there comes this moment of silence where the storm becomes calm and the dust settles. And they see each other clearly and they see their situation clearly, and they're then able to see that path forward together. It's a beautiful moment. And once you experience that, it gives you the courage and the grit to do it again and again with more people. So it's not enough to say the words or follow the steps. You need to come from a genuine place. And something we say in mediation a lot too is it's not enough to just be neutral. The other people have to believe you are neutral. And so it's important to not only come from a genuine place, but help people believe that you really are coming from a genuine place. And to do that, you can remember some of these things. You're going to need to be transparent with your intentions. How we started off with state a clear intention, it's typically not done just once. You have to reiterate. Sometimes some suspicions will start creeping back up for them. They'll be like, why are you asking so many questions? And so you have to reiterate your intention to learn, to relate, to understand them so that you can work together. You need to build trust. So like David was saying in his table, where this is not always a one encounter thing and then you move from 0 to 60. Instead, you need to make those personal connections and build that level of trust with somebody. Maybe somebody you can do it in 5 minutes, and another person it takes you 5 years. It all depends on how much armor they're wearing. And authentically relate when you can, illuminating common ground. And the beautiful thing about common ground is that no matter how different our lives are, we all share an emotional common ground. We all know what pain and grief and frustration and joy feel like. So if nothing else, you can relate there. And respecting the past, but not dwelling on it. And I'll close this section with a quote from Alan Alda that I love so much. And he talks about how true communication requires true listening. And real listening is a willingness to let the other person change you. Remember how we talked about changing your mind is changing your world? That is terrifying. But by following vocab, displaying that vulnerability, taking off your armor, and just even being willing to be moved by the other person, you open the door to actually having that meaningful dialogue. Maybe you leave unchanged, but you were willing to be changed. That's the important part. So if it wasn't almost 8:10, we would do this other exercise, but I'm going to leave this to you as homework. So think of something you feel strongly about, some sort of divisive topic, and write it down as an inflammatory hot take. Maybe you wouldn't normally phrase it that way, but maybe other people who believe it would. And then share what you've learned with somebody that you trust. Teach them what you have learned tonight. and then engage with them. Try to have a civil discourse about it where they adopt the opposite perspective, and then encourage them to do the same and switch roles. It takes practice. It takes a lot of practice to do this well, and we need to be intentional with that practice. Any questions before we go into a summary? All right. Yes. We can probably make them available. I don't know. I guess I'd have to chat with Mike. But lots of people have been taking photos of them, so I think we could probably do that. But if nothing else, you've got an in, John. You know me. So, all right. So the summary. These topics become escalated because they hit on our foundational needs as humans. They threaten our view of the world and of ourselves, and they threaten us with a loss that is typically very personal and very significant to us. And then they ask us, with that loss, to enter an unfamiliar place with humility. We typically approach these topics very poorly because our default attitudes and reactions are poor. And all of those defaults have origin stories. And by understanding those origin stories using the ladder of inference and the rule of 6, we're able to perhaps learn more about ourselves and other people and overcome those defaults and move into a more productive way of viewing and reacting to conflict. How to de-escalate, focusing on your own mindset, how it starts with you. Vulnerability, ownership, communication, acceptance, boundaries. Recognizing storm for what it is and taking the ownership to help shift the situation from storm to calm. And then yield and redirecting. In a conversation over the course of time, it might vary. And the steps being showing curiosity, listening for interest, proving you listen, and looking to the future with our Tai Chi metaphor. The conversation itself, it's a clear intention. I'm curious to understand your perspective on, making it personal to them. Opening with curiosity, what are your thoughts on it? Very judgmental free, just very open. Respecting the past, what inspired you to think that about that? And I found that word inspired is really powerful. It'll cause most people to pause and really think deeply on why they hold a certain belief. Focusing on the future, what are your hopes for the future regarding? And then loop for understanding throughout, confirm that you understand. And true listening requires an openness to being changed by the other person. So, well, we're not done yet. You got one little bit. Do you want a question though? Yes, go ahead and take a business card up front if you want to talk about more partnerships. I'd be happy to chat. All right. So it takes a nation to preserve democracy. And restoring civil discourse is one significant piece of that. For everyone in this room tonight, we are not the entire solution, but we are all part of it. We all have the responsibility to set aside this us versus them facade we've created and engage with those we have seen as our adversaries. The first step is the hardest, letting their perspective in and vulnerably sharing our own. But with time and repetition, this gets easier. We begin to see that very few hard and fast divisions among us can stand the test of genuine curiosity. And with enough time and enough repetition, we begin to see the full spectrum of nuanced perspectives that connects our two extremes. And from there, we understand there never really was a them. There was and only is us. And so with this in our minds and in our hearts, let us overcome our ideological divides by restoring the missing piece of civil discourse so that we may see the full spectrum that weaves together our U.S. democracy. Thank you.